It's amazing. We couldn't stop it if we had to. You hear that kind of excitement, that buzz, when a church planting movement really takes off. This seemingly spontaneous multiplication of churches.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it? That feeling of something catching fire.
Totally. But what our sources this week dig into is, well, the flip side. These movements can be stopped. And often it's by things done with, the best intentions.
Yeah, that's the fascinating tension here. Something that seems, I guess, designed for this rapid, almost viral growth. But our sources show how very human, sometimes well-meaning actions can, well, put the brakes on.
Exactly. It's less about outside forces fighting it and more about how we, internally, might accidentally smother that spark.
Right. And this isn't just for people in, ministry settings.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The source material talks about these 7 deadly sins, pitfalls that can stop these movements cold. And, our mission today is really to unpack these.
Because when you look closely, these issues, things like having a clear goal, sticking to core principles, how you actually do things, integrity, unhealthy dependencies fitting the culture, and, well, taking responsibility, they apply everywhere.
Absolutely. If you're trying to grow anything, a business, a community group, maybe even just a personal project, understanding these traps, how to avoid them, that's pretty crucial. So let's dive in.
Okay, first up is the first deadly sin, blurred vision. The source uses that great analogy. You can't hit what you can't see.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So if a church planting movement doesn't have this, passionately held, clearly communicated vision, well, all that energy just gets scattered. No focus.
Like, trying to build something complex without any blueprints, maybe? You need to know what the end goal looks like.
Exactly. And the source stresses this isn't a one-and-done thing. You can't just state the vision once.
Right. You need to keep coming back to it, like a touchstone.
Precisely. Asking, okay, does this action actually move us towards that vision? It has to be, front and center.
And they link it to faith, too, don't they? That idea of being sure of what you hope for, even when you can't see it yet.
Yeah, it's beautifully put. This whole act of vision casting lets people almost, feel and taste the goal before it's fully real. It gives that drive.
So if you can't vividly imagine it, you're unlikely to make it happen.
Pretty much. And for you listening, that just hammers home how vital a clear why and what is for anything you're trying to achieve. What are you really aiming for?
Okay, let's move to the second deadly sin, improving the Bible. Now, that title definitely grabs your attention.
It does, right? It sounds almost provocative.
Yeah.
But the point underneath is really important. The source kind of asks, tongue-in-cheek, improve the Bible, think it can't be done. Well, you're right, so why do we keep trying?
Okay, so what's the real issue then?
It's about that human tendency, really, to add extra rules, stuff that's not actually in the core teachings. And these additions can become this heavy weight for new people, kind of obscuring the main thing. Ah, okay. Like making things more complicated than they need to be. It reminds me a bit of the Pharisees and how Jesus criticized them for adding burdens.
Exactly that. The source points right to Jesus condemning that kind of thing, adding cumbersome requirements that, well, they get in the way.
They become barriers.
Yes. And the source says this is particularly damaging when we distort the basic ideas of what the church is or who leaders should be. It argues the Bible keeps these things intentionally simple.
Like that verse where 2 or 3 gather in my name.
Precisely. Matthew 18:20. It highlights that the core of church is Christ's presence with people who follow him. It's not about, the building size or
having specific credentials like a seminary degree necessarily.
Right. The source really emphasizes that being the body of Christ is about a Christ-like life, a relationship. They mention how Judas's replacement was chosen someone who'd been with Jesus.
And Paul's criteria for leaders.
Yeah, those focus on character being reputable followers of Christ. It's about who you are, fundamentally, not just what qualifications you have on paper. So the danger is adding complexity that wasn't intended.
Exactly. And that's a trap in any field, isn't it? We can over-engineer things, add layers of rules, and lose sight of the simple core purpose. Makes it harder for anyone new to jump in.
Keep it simple. Focus on the essentials. Okay, the third deadly sin. Sequentialism. This sounds like it's about process.
It is. It gets into the how. The source describes sequentialism in this context as a very linear step-by-step approach.
Okay, like first learn the language, then build relationships, then share your faith, then someone converts, then you disciple them, then form a group, then find leaders.
Exactly. A very orderly sequence.
Which sounds, well, logical on the surface, organized.
It does. But the argument here is that it's deadly for these kinds of movements because it's just too slow. And if any single step gets blocked or delayed,
The whole thing grinds to a halt?
right, the whole chain breaks. So the alternative they highlight is more like practicing the end from the beginning.
What does that look like?
Well, in successful movements, you might see people sharing their faith, even while they're still, grappling with the language, or forming small groups with brand new believers, maybe even seekers, right away.
So you're doing evangelism, discipleship, church formation, leadership development, kind of all at the same time.
Exactly. It's much more integrated, much more dynamic, not waiting for step C before you even think about step D.
But what about the argument for laying a good foundation first? Isn't that important?
Oh, absolutely. But the source argues that a good foundation is more about sound teaching and, crucially, obedience to what's learned, rather than just the sheer amount of time spent in preparation.
Oh, okay. So delaying the multiplication part can actually send the wrong message. Like it's not urgent.
Yeah, that's the idea. It can kill the momentum. And, the lesson for anyone listening trying to launch something is powerful. That temptation to plan every single step perfectly.
Before you even start.
Right? It's strong, but often a more iterative approach, learning, doing, building simultaneously, can be way more effective, gets things moving faster, start doing, learn as you go.
Okay, on to the fourth deadly sin. Unsavory salt. That's a vivid image.
It really is. It draws on that idea from Revelation about losing your first love, basically trying to grow something vital, using a compromised, unhealthy version of the core principles.
Like trying to grow wheat on a salt flat, as the source says.
Exactly. It just won't work. The ground isn't fertile.
And they actually challenge that common idea of always working through existing local churches.
Yeah, they argue that if an existing church has become unsavory, their term, it can actually be a major roadblock, not a help.
So what makes a church unsavory in this context?
The source breaks it down into three things. First, being cancer-ridden, meaning there's unaddressed sin, compromises that are draining its life.
Okay.
Second, being contentious, just constant internal fights and quarrels that distract everyone from the main mission. And third, being comatose, totally inward-looking, lost contact with anyone outside, basically having a who cares attitude about the core purpose, like the Great Commission.
That's pretty stark. They even quote Paul telling Timothy to avoid people who have a form of godliness but deny its power.
Have nothing to do with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's strong advice, but the solution offered isn't about judging from the outside.
What is it then?
It's about demonstrating the alternative, a vibrant, living expression of faith, free of those crippling issues, too busy serving to be fighting internally, genuinely loving people.
Yeah.
That healthy example is the most powerful corrective.
So for any movement or organization, the takeaway is that internal health, sticking to core values, it's absolutely non-negotiable for growth. Ignoring internal problems can be fatal.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, number 5, the fifth deadly sin, the devil's candy. Intriguing name.
Yeah, it's metaphorical, obviously.
Yeah.
The idea is like candy gives you a quick sugar rush, feels good momentarily, but offers no real lasting nourishment.
So these are good things, virtues even. Seemingly good things, yes. Sweet Christian virtues, the source calls them, but they become devil's candy if they distract from or undermine the main vision, which in this context is churches planting more churches.
Can you give an example?
Money is the key one they use. Money itself isn't bad, obviously, but the temptation to use, say, readily available foreign money to quickly hire pastors or put up nice buildings, it creates fast results, but it's not sustainable locally.
Ah, the extension cord across the ocean idea they mentioned. It looks like power, but it's totally dependent on an outside source.
Exactly. For a movement to truly have life, to spread on its own, it needs its own engine, its own fuel, local leadership, local resources.
Even if that seems slower, maybe riskier at first.
Yes, because it builds genuine capacity.
Bruh.
The source brings in this great little fable by Roland Allen about Lucifer offering support that prevents falling.
I remember reading that.
Yeah.
The point being,
if you always cushion the fall, if you always provide external subsidies to prevent failure, you rob the new entity of the chance to struggle, to learn, to develop its own strength and resilience. You prevent the very process that leads to true growth.
wow, that's counterintuitive, but makes a lot of sense. Don't over-support to the point of creating dependence.
Precisely. Allow for the learning that comes from, well, sometimes stumbling and getting back up on your own. Critical insight for anyone fostering growth.
Okay, the sixth deadly sin, alien abduction. This seems to be about culture and context.
Exactly. The gospel message might be universal, but a church planting movement needs to feel like it belongs in its specific place. It shouldn't have this smell of foreignness about it.
So how does this abduction happen?
The source points to three main ways. One is forcing new believers to swap their own cultural expressions for foreign ones, like, music, leadership styles, ways of meeting.
Okay, imposing outside norms.
Yeah. Second is creating that welfare state we just talked about, dependency on foreign money and resources.
Right, the devil's candy link.
And third is injecting foreign elements into church life that simply can't be replicated locally. Things that require outside expertise or funding indefinitely.
So successful movements look and feel local. If the houses are bamboo, the churches are bamboo.
That's the idea. They take on the shape and texture of their context. Small apartments mean meetings in small apartments. It feels natural, not imported.
And there's a key question they suggest asking.
Yes, for every single new church plant, can this church be reproduced by these believers using their resources? And if the answer is no, because of some foreign element, then you need to rethink that element, ditch it if necessary.
Exactly. It's all about local ownership, reproducibility, sustainability.
Yeah.
And that applies to any initiative you want to scale, right? If it relies on stuff that isn't available or adaptable locally, it's probably not going to spread far on its own.
Makes total sense. Okay, finally, the seventh deadly sin. Blaming God. Wow, this one sounds serious. The source calls it the single greatest barrier. That's what they claim, yes. It's a powerful statement. The core idea is that while obviously God's power is central to any spiritual movement, we can't ignore the crucial part of human responsibility.
How so? What does blaming God look like here?
It often looks like saying, well, we tried, but I guess it's just not God's time for these people. The source calls this divine dismissal.
Divine dismissal. That's a striking phrase.
Isn't it? It sounds pious, maybe, but the source argues it's often just an excuse for not looking at our own methods, our own actions, and seeing if we need to change something.
So it's still dismissal, just cloaked in religious language.
That's the argument, and they use the analogy of personal salvation. God has done everything necessary, but humans are still called to share the message, and people have the freedom to respond or not.
There's a human role in the process.
Right. And they suggest church planting movements work similarly, a kind of divine human covenant. God initiates, God empowers, but our faithful, responsible, adaptable participation is also key.
So this sin is about abdicating our responsibility by putting it all back on God when maybe we are the bottleneck.
Yeah, that seems to be the core message. It's a challenge to not use God's sovereignty as a reason to avoid self-examination and necessary changes in our own approach.
That definitely makes you think, are there areas in my own work, my own life, where I might be doing a version of that divine dismissal?
It's a searching question for sure. And the source kind of leaves us there, suggesting that you listening might hear echoes of these sins in your own world. It really invites that self-reflection.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, the main point isn't really about blame, is it? It's more about awareness.
Exactly. Understanding these 7 potential pitfalls, as outlined in our source material, helps us identify where things can go wrong in any effort that aims for growth, for impact.
And there's a hopeful note too. The source says something like, for every obstacle offers a bridge to overcome it.
Yeah, recognizing the problem is the first step to finding a solution.
Which kind of leads to a final thought for you to chew on. If even in these spiritually focused movements, the human element, our choices, our methods, our willingness to adapt is so critical, what overlooked responsibilities might you need to consider in the places you want to see growth?
Whether that's your job, your community work, your personal goals, where might you need to take more ownership, perhaps?
Definitely something to mull over.
Yeah.
And just to give context, the source material for this discussion draws heavily on the work and extensive experience of David Garrison. He served as Associate Vice President for Global Strategy for the Southern Baptist International Mission Board.
So these aren't just abstract theories. They come from years of observation on the ground, really practical insights.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive.
Until next time.